Hi there, my name is Sean McGeever, and I am a Young Life leader at Pinnacle High School, and I work let me see there. Love while help, but probably need to hit bed soon. Yeah, I'm with you. I should probably be in bed, but I'm going to squeak this in. So, anyway, yeah, so my name is Sean McGeever, and I'm a Young Life leader at Pinnacle High School, work for Young Life here in Phoenix, Arizona. I am finishing up the series on the odd chapters of the Gospel of John for our club talks. This one took a little bit longer for me to get to just with camps and other things, but I'm really excited because I get to talk a little bit about the resurrection and responding to Christ. So for this one, we're going to look at John chapter 21, and I'll post my little outline and such here, but basically I think this is a perfect chapter to wrap up a semester of talks after you've talked about the cross. I would say jump into this because verses 1 through 14 have a great story about Jesus's interaction with the disciples after he's resurrected. And then it goes into a conversation between Jesus and Peter, and it's perfect for a response. So if you wanted to have like a resurrection and appropriation talk, you could split it into two talks, but a lot of time in Young Life clubs and camps, they'll put them together. This one is perfect. So for the first part, I would just talk about the resurrection, which you'll need to set it doesn't include chapter 20. So if you're talking about the cross right before this, you have to say, basically where we leave Jesus is he's dead on a cross and buried in a tomb. Well, now Jesus is resurrected, and I want to tell you about the God who's alive, who's not dead. So what happens is Jesus has actually appeared to the disciples, but now they go back to fishing. So they kind of go back to what they're used to. Then Jesus encounters them on the shore and instructs them in the miraculous catch. Then he invites them back onto shore where they have a barbecue. So this is a little bit about resurrection and Jesus's interaction. I'll comment a little bit more about that in a moment. But then the second part is about at least Peter's response and Jesus's response. And I call this the first section déjà vu, from denying Jesus to loving Jesus. So they actually go hand in hand. So Peter's denials in chapter 18, he has three denials, as you probably know. What you might recall is that those denials kind of center around a fire that Peter is warming his hands, and two of his denials come right then. So it's in chapter 18, verse 18. And Peter is there around a charcoal fire. Well, Peter's reinstatement and his three questions for Peter, kind of in response to that, also happen around a charcoal fire. I mean, John definitely writes this to grab our attention. So I call it déjà vu, from denying Jesus to loving Jesus. So they both happen around a fire. And then after the section about loving Jesus, it goes into about following Jesus, and it talks about how it will be difficult for Peter and it might be difficult for us. So this is just a great response section. We need to go from denying Christ and not living for him and not knowing him to loving him and following him, including when it may be difficult. So that's a great realistic picture of what it means to follow Jesus. It's not always just the easiest thing in the world, and Jesus makes that clear to Peter. So we may as well too when we talk to students. So I have that all outlined if you want to download that. A couple main points would be, one is the cross is about death. It's an important part of the story of Jesus, but it is about primarily death. But the resurrection is about life. We need to talk about Jesus in Young Life, about him being alive. Often the cross is the emphasis and the focal point of our club talks, of our camp weeks, and all that. That if you read 1 Corinthians 15 and just the thrust of the Bible and the coming of the Holy Spirit and our God who's alive, needs to be a significant message. As much as we can work to make it even a better and bigger and a more exciting and dramatic message than our crosstalk, we should do that. So the resurrection is about life. Second, Jesus rose from the dead to bring us back into a right relationship with him. And you can see this right here. Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, he's inviting them into continued miracles. He's inviting them into continued relationship, into continued fellowship, and continued forgiveness, into all of that. So Jesus invites the disciples back into a right relationship with him because he's now alive. Remember, the last thing they were doing at his death was they were running away and denying him. And they're bringing him, he's bringing him right back in to follow him. Also, that though we deny him, he defeats death. He sets a table for us and asks us if we want to follow him. There's a couple things that this passage shows us about Jesus. First is in verse 1, he's alive. Jesus is alive. He also calls his followers friends. So right there in verse 5 says, he called out to them, friends, haven't you any fish? Jesus calls us friends, not, little, unimportant humans down on earth. He calls us friends, which is a really dynamic way that God can interact with us. Jesus can do miracles. He does yet another one. He'd been doing them all through the Gospel of John, but here he does another miracle to help him catch a massive amount of fish in verse 6. And then another thing that this shows us about Jesus is that even though he does the miracle and lets them catch the fish, Jesus actually doesn't need the fish. In verse 9, it's fascinating. It says, when they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. Jesus already had fish. Jesus already had bread. And yet he still invites us to do the things which will help us recognize Jesus as Lord. So that whole miraculous catch, it wasn't because Jesus needed fish in order to have the barbecue. He already had the barbecue set. He wanted them to participate in a miracle which would help them recognize that it was Christ who was on the shore. And then they bring back the fish. And who knows, maybe they ate some of them later. But Jesus was the one who already had the fish, which is a good lesson for us, especially those of us in ministry, but also the continued Christian life. What does this have to do with our life? This passage shows us as they went back to catch fish, they are tempted, and we all are tempted to go back to our own ways, especially if our view is that Jesus is dead. If Jesus is dead, if the cross is the emphasis of the gospel, it might tempt us to just think that God is distant, God is dead, God is not active. But the truth of the matter is that Jesus is alive. And this has to do with our life, that we might, when we realize that Jesus is alive, he might be calling us to not go back to our old ways, but to go into new ways, into new life. In this story, the disciples experienced a miracle and recognized Jesus only after they obeyed. So Jesus calls out to them and tells them to fish on the other side. Once they do that, they experience the miracle. So the miracle comes, at least in this story, after they obey Jesus. Another thing that this has to do with our life is that Jesus calls us to love him, just like he does for Peter in verses 15 through 17. And Jesus calls us to follow him, even if we will suffer. And if we follow Jesus, we likely will suffer, verses 18 through 19. A couple technical details that you may or may not need to mention in a club talk, but might be good to know. Many of the disciples were fishermen. And also, if you or a fisherman, it would have been often better for them to fish at night. They would have caught more. So that they're fishing at night isn't some strange, like they're trying to hide or something like that. That would have been a great time to fish. So there's one point. Also, there's a kind of bizarre encounter with Peter taking off his outer garment. He wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off. The details of exactly how that work, as I've looked into it through multiple commentaries, my own study, aren't super clear. It might be, the phrase actually literally means that he was naked, but it might be that he had it wrapped, his cloak around him. Whatever it was, the main point of it is that Peter was very eager to go see Jesus. So he just kind of in a bizarre way wants to go see Jesus, no matter how awkward or strange it is. And also kind of strangely, he doesn't help them bring the boat in or the miraculous fish. So I would make, it's a little humorous, but it's not really that important to try to sort through that. And no one has kind of figured that out. I already mentioned this, that in chapter 21, verse 9, and in chapter 18, verse 18, these are where it says the fire of burning coals. They saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it. That phrase, fire of burning coals, it's the exact same Greek word that we have in chapter 18. So as I mentioned before, where I see a parallel, deja vu from denying Jesus to loving Jesus, the literal same Greek word is used there. So it's certainly there to draw our attention. John is doing that on purpose. The last kind of relevant technical detail would have to do with verses 15 through 17, where there's the interaction between with Peter and Jesus. And Jesus keeps saying, do you love me? The first two times Jesus says, do you love me? And he uses the Greek word agape. So do you agape love me? And Peter, in the first and the second time, he says, yes, you know that I love you. And he uses the word phileo. So basically Jesus is saying, do you love me this way? And Peter decides to use a different word for love. So that's how they respond the first and the second time. But the third time, Jesus doesn't say, do you agape me? Do you love me with the word agape? He ends up saying, do you phileo me? So what Jesus is saying there is he uses the word that Peter uses for love. Now, some people think that what is going on there is that Jesus sees really where Peter's at and says, if that's the way that you love me, phileo, some people tend to think that it's more of a brotherly or familial love, and agape is more of a self-giving, altruistic, Christ-like love. That Jesus is saying, if that's where you're at, then I'll go ahead and I'll say that that's where we'll start. We'll start with the way that you can love me. But actually, modern scholars are pretty unanimous in saying that the way that John uses those words means that they're nearly synonymous. So that to not get too caught up on the difference in words, this is obviously a really technical detail, but it's one I've noticed before. The main point here isn't what kind of words that Peter and Jesus are using for love, but the main point is Jesus is demanding a loving relationship with him. And so that's the emphasis and the key thrust of that part there. Here's a couple ideas for illustrations, and then I'm pretty much done, which is one great way to think through illustrations would be if you were a stage manager to try to set this up. What are the things that you would need to go buy and set up? So you might need a boat, you might need fishing rods, you might need nets, you might need a fire, rocks to make it look like you're setting a fire, you might need fish and bread. Any of these things you could use to get attention for the people who are listening, and you may as well bring them in. They're part of the story. To try to make a point, here's another illustration to make a point about the resurrection. When I've spoke about the resurrection, one of my favorite ways to demonstrate that God is alive is I will ask every Young Life leader who's in the crowd to stand up, and I'll ask everyone to look at them, and I'll say, here's something that I want to tell you. I can prove to you that God is alive, that Jesus is resurrected, and he's alive and working right now. And I'll say, look at your leader. And I'm going to ask them a couple questions. I'll say, do you know that God is working in your life? And they'll all say yes. Do you have an active relationship with the living God right now? Yes. Have you seen God work and change in your life over time? Yes. And basically I'll just say, look, I'll have them sit down and I'll say, look, probably my greatest proof that God is alive is that the people around you that are Christians, and the leaders are the ones I wanted to ask right now, they attest to God being alive in their life. And that's the greatest proof I can have. So I like talking about the leaders and their ongoing relationship with Jesus as a way to illustrate the resurrection and the power of life through the resurrection. One last thing as a possible illustration is to just use the three statements that Jesus has with Peter here as a response. So basically, these could be your appropriation statements or illustration. I would put these maybe on a poster. Maybe they could be 3 posters. Maybe you just put them in the PowerPoint or Keynote, put them up on the screen. But here are the 3 questions for appropriation or for maybe coming to Christ. 1, do you want to love God? Do you love God, or do you want to love God as best as you're able? 2, do you know that it will not always be easy? In fact, you will likely suffer if you want to follow God. And 3, are you willing to follow Jesus as he leads you through life? So those are just 3 simple and clear questions that you could put up on a screen or a poster to try to really drive home the point about what it might mean to follow Jesus. Actually, I was just at camp this weekend, and Steve McCarthy was our speaker, and he did a great job with an illustration with this phrase, follow me. He asked someone to come up out on the stage, and he said, it's not that complicated. When Jesus is saying, follow me, I want to show you how complicated this is. He said, you, come out of the crowd. Now, here's what I want you to do. I want you to stand up and follow me. I want you to get right behind me, and wherever I go, I want you to just follow me. And he took about 10 seconds to just kind of walk around the stage a little bit, and then he would stop, and then the person behind him would stop, and everyone would laugh, and then he would walk for just maybe 5 more seconds and stop, and the person behind him would stop. And he goes, it's that simple. Jesus is going to lead you through life, and when he says go, go. When he says stop, stop. All you have to do is follow Jesus. That's what he wants for your life. So, yeah, those are a couple ideas that I have there about doing a club talk on the Gospel of John. There's a lot of other ways that you could go with this, but hopefully that's helpful. So, thanks for listening, and many blessings on your club talks out there. I'm looking forward to going through the other chapters in John, hopefully in the spring, if anyone will hang in there with me.